Why did the silence after the firefight feel heavier than the explosions themselves? Thomas noticed it before his ears stopped ringing. Not the absence of sound exactly, more like a pressure, as if the air itself was holding something back. The outpost was still burning in places, embers drifting lazily through the fractured corridors, but the noise had drained away too quickly. He slowed without meaning to. His squad did not. Boots moved with precision over shattered composite stone. Weapons stayed raised. Targets were already categorized as neutralized. The mission had been clean, efficient. That was how 73 years of war had trained them to think. Simple objectives, no room for residue. Thomas had learned over time that humans were bad at that kind of thinking. They lingered. They noticed what remained after the checklist was complete. He scanned the ruin again, his eyes catching on a collapsed beam near the inner wall. Something there did not match the rest of the destruction. Not heat, not movement the sensors cared about, just a flicker, a rise and fall too irregular to be structural settling. Rear contact, he said, already moving. Plasma rifles snapped toward him, targeting reticles flaring to life. No one hesitated. Hesitation had been burned out of them long ago. Thomas raised a hand sharply. Stand down. Confusion crackled through the comms. Orders were repeated back to him, questioned. Thomas did not answer. He crouched instead, pushing aside debris with gloved hands already stained darker than the ash around them. The beam shifted. Beneath it was a body curled inward, scaled skin dulled and cracked, limbs too thin, chest fluttering with shallow breaths that barely counted as breathing. A child. The word arrived uninvited. Not an assessment, not a classification, a fact. The cub could not have been more than 5 or 6 by human measure. Its eyes were half open, unfocused, too tired to be afraid. Thomas felt something twist under his ribs, an old sensation he had learned to bury beneath reports and after-action summaries. Protocol filled his mind instantly, reflexively. Enemy offspring, future combatant, statistically acceptable loss. Protocol did not breathe like this. "I'm taking him," Thomas said. The words landed wrong, too quiet, too final. "You understand what that means," his commander replied, voice clipped through the translator. 4 eyes never left the thermal display. "I understand what I'm doing." There was a pause, then "You will face tribunal." Thomas lifted the child carefully. The body was lighter than it should have been. The cub made a small sound, more instinct than voice, and clutched weakly at Thomas's uniform as if it were the only solid thing left in the universe. "Yeah," Thomas said under his breath, "I know." No one spoke as they returned to the transport. The cub's breathing filled the space between them, fragile and uneven. Thomas felt the weight with every step, not in his arms but behind his eyes. For the first time in years he felt afraid, not of death, of being seen. Why did mercy feel like a crime when survival had become law? The medical bay refused him. Authorization codes failed. Treating enemy wounded was one thing. Bringing one aboard by choice was something else entirely. Regulations rose in front of him like a wall, each clause another reminder of how narrow the acceptable path had become. Thomas turned away. He locked the door to his quarters and set the child down on a folded thermal blanket. For 7 days, while the tribunal assembled their questions, Thomas became something he barely recognized anymore. A caretaker. He cleaned wounds with hands that had ended hundreds of lives. He crushed nutrient paste into something soft enough to swallow. He sat through long nights as fever took hold, and the cub cried out in a language Thomas did not understand but did not need to. Fear sounded the same everywhere. By the 3rd day the cub could sit up. By the 5th he could eat without choking. By the 7th, scars traced pink lines where open wounds had been. Thomas did not give him a name out loud. Names carried expectations. But in his mind he called him kid, a word that asked for nothing. At night, as the ship hummed and tribunal notices blinked unanswered, Thomas sat on the floor and watched the child sleep. He wondered when he had stopped believing that this mattered. The alarm came before the tribunal could. Battle stations. Thomas moved on instinct, pulling the child close as the ship shuddered. Through the viewport, space darkened with ships, hundreds, an armada. They would be gone in minutes. But the weapons did not fire. A single craft detached, white plasma field, parley. "They're requesting an exchange," someone said, disbelief cracking through professional calm. Thomas looked down. The child was staring at the screen, not afraid, recognizing. What did vengeance do when it met a living answer? The docking bay was silent when the delegation arrived. Massive forms shaped by war and ritual. The female at the front saw the child and made a sound that tore through every translator, raw and ancient. The cub ran. The reunion was desperate. Hands searching for injuries that no longer existed. Tears from eyes that had ordered worlds burned. When she turned to Thomas, she did not threaten him. She knelt. "We came for war," she said. "Dead or alive, but he lives." Her voice shook. "You were his enemy," she continued, "yet you chose him." She stood, voice carrying. "This war ends today." No one breathed. "We will remember," she said, "that humanity is not a species. It is a choice." 6 months later, Thomas stood in a garden built where a weapons platform had once orbited. The child, Kit now, laughed among others his age. The tribunal had dissolved. The war was over. Thomas did not feel proud or heroic. Just whole. Sometimes dignity did not speak. It simply acted. Why did the universe wait until the war was ending to ask him what it had taken from him? The question surfaced later quietly after the armada without firing a single shot, after the docking bay emptied, after Kit was escorted gently back to his parents. Thomas stood alone in his quarters, staring at the small pallet on the floor where the child had slept, folded neatly now, like a ghost pretending it might return. He had not planned on saving anyone. That truth landed harder than the tribunal ever could. He had not rebelled, had not weighed ethics against orders. He had simply seen a child where the war demanded an enemy, and once seen, that could not be undone. Sleep did not come easily. Dreams dragged him back through other ruins, other bodies, moments where he had not stepped between weapon and target. Faces blurred together until only eyes remained, asking a question he had never answered then. Why not me? When peace arrived, it did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. And that was only the beginning. What do you do when the war ends, but the soldier inside you doesn't know how to stop standing guard? Thomas learned the answer slowly and not by choice. Peace arrived without ceremony, without a final order telling him where to stand or what to aim at. The ship drifted into quiet orbit above a pale blue world that had never hosted a battle, only the consequences of them. Refuge lanes traced its gravity well like scars you could see from space. He was told the assignment was rest, mandatory leave, as if rest were something that could be issued and with. The station felt wrong the moment he stepped off the transport. Too open, too unguarded. No reinforced bulkheads, no overlapping kill zones. Just wide corridors filled with people who moved without formation, without purpose drilled into their bodies. Families, former prisoners, displaced civilians from both sides of the war, carrying what little had survived evacuation. Thomas watched them from a distance, hands clasped behind his back out of habit, posture still locked in readiness. He told himself he was observing. What he was really doing was waiting for something to go wrong. Without conflict to structure his days, the things he had buried began to surface. Memories slipped through the cracks in quiet moments. A burned settlement glimpsed through a viewport. The smell of ionized air after plasma discharge. Orders repeated until they stopped sounding like words. He had survived by narrowing his world. Peace widened it again, and the space felt dangerous. A counselor tried to speak with him on the third day. She kept her voice gentle, movement slow. "You don't have to be strong here," she said. Thomas nodded, said nothing. Strength had never been the problem. He simply did not know how to be anything else. It was a child who broke the stalemate. A human girl, maybe 7, dropped a ration pack in the corridor. It split open on impact, the sharp sound echoing too cleanly, too much like a weapon discharge. She froze. Her shoulders curled inward. Her eyes went wide, already bracing for punishment that never came. Thomas reacted before thought caught up. He lowered himself to one knee, movements deliberate, visible, non-threatening. "It's okay," he said quietly. "It happens." The girl studied him, distress battling exhaustion. Finally, she nodded. As they gathered the scattered food, something loosened in Thomas's chest. Not the past, just the present. After that, he began helping without formally deciding to, carrying supplies, sitting with those who couldn't sleep, translating when voices shook too much to hold steady. He never wore his uniform, never told stories. He didn't want to be a reminder of what they had escaped. He just wanted to be useful in a way that didn't involve calculating survival odds. One evening, he noticed a familiar posture across the mess hall. An adolescent from the other species sat alone, tail wrapped tight, eyes tracking every movement. Food untouched. Guards nearby, tense but restrained. Thomas hesitated. Old instincts flared. Old lessons whispered consequences. Then another image overlaid them. Small claws gripping his sleeve beneath rubble. He picked up a tray and approached. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, using the trade dialect. The adolescent did not answer, did not move, but did not bare teeth either. They ate in silence. Minutes passed. Then quietly, "My clutch brother died in the war." Thomas nodded. "I'm sorry." "You fought us." "Yes." "You saved one of us." "Yes." Confusion flickered across the adolescent's face. "Why?" Thomas stared at his food longer than necessary. He had answered this question before, but now it felt different, less dramatic, more personal. "Because someone once saved me," he said, "and I didn't understand it either." It wasn't entirely true, or maybe it was. Memory blurred. A medic on a burning moon, a hand pulling him from wreckage, a voice telling him to stay conscious when it would have been easier not to. The adolescent nodded slowly, not agreement, processing. That night Thomas dreamed differently. No alarms, no explosions, just long corridors and doors he didn't open. When he woke, he realized something had shifted. The war inside him wasn't gone. But it was listening. Weeks passed. The union offered commendations. He declined. Promotions followed. He declined those too. Rank felt irrelevant now. He accepted only one thing, a transfer to a joint humanitarian unit forming under the new accords. Some called it naive. Others called it dangerous. Thomas called it necessary. The first mission was small, escorting medical supplies to a border world where trust was thin and tempers thinner. Mixed teams, species that had only met through gunfire now sharing a shuttle. Tension sat heavy in the air. Hands hovered too close to weapons that weren't supposed to be used. Thomas sat between them, not because he was in charge, because he understood what it meant to be afraid of peace. When they landed, a crowd waited, not cheering, watching, measuring. A stone flew, then another. Someone shouted. Old reflexes surged. Thomas stepped forward before anyone else could. He raised his empty hands. No speech, no orders, just presence. The stone stopped. Later, as medical tents went up and children peered from doorways, a medic stood beside him. "You are tired," she said. "Yes." "But you are still here." "Yes." She studied him. "That is strength." Thomas thought of the years he had equated strength with endurance, with silence, with obedience. This felt different, uncomfortable, real. That night, under an unfamiliar sky, he looked up at the stars and felt something close to pride. Not in what he had done during the war. In what he hadn't done since. Fear still lived in his body. He still scanned rooms, still counted exits, still woke with tension coiled beneath his skin. But now, when fear rose, it didn't automatically become anger. Sometimes it became patience, and sometimes, quietly, it became purpose. Not the kind that demanded sacrifice for banners or borders, the kind that asked you to stay, to sit, to see, to choose again and again. Not who deserved mercy, but who needed it. What happens when doing the right thing stops feeling brave and starts feeling unbearably heavy? Thomas discovered the answer on a rain-soaked border world whose name most people no longer bothered to pronounce correctly. It had once been a supply hub, then a battlefield. Now it was something in between, a place learning how to exist without knowing what it was supposed to become. The Joint Humanitarian Unit had been there 3 weeks longer than planned. Delays layered themselves quietly. Paperwork stalled. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Old grudges resurfaced wearing new language. Peace, Thomas was learning, did not explode. It eroded. The days blurred together. He woke before dawn, checked manifests, walked the perimeter. He mediated arguments that flared over nothing and everything. Water rations, tent placement, translation errors that turned neutral phrases into insults. He spoke softly, listened more than he talked. At night, when exhaustion pressed behind his eyes, he lay awake staring at canvas ceilings and wondered how many people expected him to be something he was not. A symbol. He hated that part most. Symbols did not bleed. They did not doubt themselves at 3 in the morning. They did not lie awake wondering whether one wrong word could unravel weeks of fragile restraint. The breaking point came without warning. A supply convoy failed to arrive. At first it was logged as a navigation error, then a communications blackout. Then the rumors began, old ones sharpened and reused, whispers of betrayal, of militants who had never accepted the ceasefire, of humans looking for an excuse to reclaim lost ground. Tension thickened. Hands drifted closer to weapons that had been issued just in case. Thomas felt it too. That frightened him most. When the alert came, it was already too late to feel prepared. A skirmish, small, they said, contained. By the time Thomas reached the site, rain had turned the ground to mud and 2 bodies lay still in it. One human, one not, both young, both dead for reasons no one could clearly explain. Voices overlapped. Accusations moved faster than facts. Thomas pushed through the crowd, heart pounding harder than it ever had in combat. This was how it started. This was how it always started. He knelt beside the bodies, ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes. He did not touch them. He just looked. Really looked. Fear had frozen their faces. Not hatred, not resolve, just fear caught mid-breath. A human officer grabbed his arm. "We need to secure the perimeter before this spreads." An elder hissed in response, translators struggling to keep up. "Your kind fired first." Every eye turned to Thomas. The space between them closed in. The weight pressed down on his chest, heavier than any armor he had worn. He felt the old instinct surge, sharp and efficient. Issue orders, separate sides, show force. It would work. It always did, briefly. If I spoke wrong now, he realized, people would die. He took a breath, then another. "No one moves," he said, not loudly, calmly, the kind of calm that didn't demand obedience but invited it. "Not until we understand what happened." "They're already dead," someone shouted. "Yes," Thomas said, "and if we rush, there will be more." Silence crept in, uneasy, real. The investigation took hours. Humans and others working together because the alternative was unthinkable. Arguments flared, accusations resurfaced, but slowly, painfully, the shape of the truth emerged. A third party, smugglers, profiteers feeding on instability, armed with stolen tech, eager to ignite old hatreds for new gain. The convoy had been ambushed, the skirmish staged to look like betrayal. When it became clear, the anger did not vanish, but it redirected. Thomas sank onto a crate, exhaustion crashing through him all at once. A medic stood nearby, rain streaking down her visor. "You could have ordered force," she said. I wanted to, Thomas admitted. The honesty surprised him. For a moment it felt like relief. She studied him. Easier is rarely better. That night sleep refused him. The images replayed. The bodies. The shouting. The moment balanced on a knife's edge where everything could have collapsed. He wondered how many more times he could stand in that space between fear and fury without something inside him breaking. He thought of Kit, not the child running through gardens, the one beneath rubble, trembling, waiting to see if the next being he saw would end his life or spare it. Peace wasn't a single choice. It was a series of them, and each demanded something different. The next morning, Thomas volunteered to escort the recovered convoy route personally, not as protection, as presence. The decision unsettled everyone. It was dangerous. That was obvious. Someone told him he didn't have to keep proving anything. "I'm not proving," Thomas said. "I'm practicing." The road was long and quiet, the kind of quiet that made you listen to your own thoughts whether you wanted to or not. He rode visible, unarmored. If someone wanted to make a statement, he would be an easy one. No one attacked. Villagers emerged cautiously as the convoy passed. Some watched in silence. Some waved. Trust did not arrive all at once. It trickled. At a checkpoint near dusk, a young guard hesitated, then slowly lowered his weapon. Thomas met his gaze and nodded. Nothing more. That night, as the convoy rolled safely back into camp, Thomas felt the exhaustion deepen. But beneath it, something steadier formed. Not confidence. Commitment. He understood then that this work would never make him clean. It would never make him famous. It would ask him to absorb tension, to be misunderstood, to stand in the gap when others pulled away. Some days it would hurt more than the war ever had. But as children, human and otherwise, shared food by lantern light, Thomas felt a quiet certainty settle in his bones. Strength was not about how much violence you could endure. It was about how much responsibility you were willing to carry, without letting it harden you. Peace did not need heroes. It needed people stubborn enough to keep choosing it, even when it stopped feeling like victory and started feeling like work. What if the hardest part of redemption isn't what you've done, but how long you have to live with remembering it? The question came to Thomas on a night when nothing went wrong. No alarms, no raised voices, no shadows moving where they shouldn't. The camp slept under a thin veil of stars and the quiet felt almost gentle. That was when it surfaced, not as relief, as exposure. Thomas sat near the perimeter, boots planted in cooling dust, turning the talisman over in his hands. Its surface had been worn smooth long before it reached him, shaped by generations of use, but now his own thumb traced the same groove again and again. He had carried it through negotiations and skirmishes, through moments when anger rose so fast it frightened him. It had become an anchor. Anchors only mattered because something inside you was still drifting. The summons arrived just after midnight. Union command, formal language, precise. A historical accountability review. His name was listed not as a hero, not as an exception, but as a witness. The war was ending officially now. That meant records opening, decisions revisited, actions measured by standards that hadn't existed when the orders were given. Thomas did not sleep after that. The review station hung in neutral space, suspended between territories like a question no one wanted to answer. White corridors, too clean, designed to feel impartial, designed to make everything echo. Thomas waited alone in a chamber that smelled faintly of recycled air and restraint. Across from him, holographic officials flickered to life. They spoke carefully, precisely, words polished until they lost all heat. "Sergeant Reed," one of them said, "you are not on trial." Thomas nodded. He did not trust that sentence. They asked him about missions, outposts, civilian casualty estimates, operational necessity. They asked him about orders he had followed, orders he had questioned, and the one he had refused. Each answer cost him something. not because he felt shame, but because memory was a form of reliving, and some moments were heavy no matter how much time passed. When they asked about the child, the room felt smaller. At one point, an official paused. "Do you believe," she asked, "that your actions undermine the war effort?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the chamber. "And do you regret that?" "No." Silence followed, not hostile, not approving, just real. The review ended without verdict or ceremony. No judgment rendered. No absolution offered. They thanked him for his candor and told him history would decide what records could not. Thomas left feeling hollow in a way he hadn't known before. Not emptied. Exposed. Back at the camp, changes had taken root in his absence. Fewer guards, more shared patrols, conversations that lingered instead of snapping shut. A child waved at him as he passed, then laughed as if surprised by her own courage. Thomas smiled before he could stop himself. Later that evening, the infirmary called for him. A woman lay on the bed, scales dulled by illness, breath shallow. A human doctor stood nearby, frustration etched deep into her face. "We're out of compatible plasma expanders," she said. "We can stabilize her for hours, not long enough." Thomas understood before she finished. "I'm compatible," he said. The doctor hesitated. "You're not cleared." "I consent." The transfer was slow, draining. He felt the familiar dizziness creep in as the world softened at the edges. As the plasma flowed, a strange calm settled over him. This wasn't sacrifice in the dramatic sense. It was practical, necessary, quiet. The woman lived. Thomas recovered on a cot, weak but steady. Later, a message arrived. A short recording, Kit's voice, older now, clearer. "I am learning," Kit said. "I help the smaller ones now, like you helped me." Thomas closed his eyes. The war had not erased what he had done. Nothing ever would. Redemption, he was learning, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let it be the final word. He returned to work with a different weight in his chest. Not lighter, shared. The burden had begun to spread, not as blame, but as responsibility carried across species, across choices. For the first time, it felt usable. As weeks passed, Thomas found himself speaking less and being heard more. He learned when to step forward and when to stay back. Learned that restraint required just as much discipline as force, sometimes more. There were still nights when memory clawed its way back, when names he would never know surfaced without invitation. He let them. He stopped trying to outrun them. One evening, a young officer asked him how he kept going. Thomas did not answer right away. He watched the camp settle for the night, lights dimming, voices softening. "I don't," he said finally. "I just don't stop." That seemed to be enough. The inquiry never published a conclusion about him. He remained an annotation, an irregularity, a footnote where a cleaner narrative might have been preferred. Thomas accepted that more easily than he would have once. Being remembered accurately mattered less than what continued after. He still carried the talisman, not as a shield, as a reminder. Memory did not have to be a sentence. It could be a responsibility. And responsibility, when shared, no longer crushed. What does a life become when it's no longer measured by what you destroy, but by what you leave standing? Thomas asked himself that question on Prime, standing at the edge of the Peace Garden as morning light filtered through crystalline growths that sang softly when the wind passed through them. He had heard the sound before in recordings, but in person it was different. Imperfect. Alive. The tones shifted subtly as the air changed, as if the garden itself were listening. Children ran between the structures. Human and other species, still awkward with one another, still learning where personal space ended and trust began. Their laughter overlapped without rhythm or design. No one tried to organize it. No one needed to. Thomas stood slightly apart, hands folded behind his back out of habit. Even without a uniform, he still looked like a soldier. Some things stayed with you. He had learned not to resent that. It was simply another fact to carry. Kit spotted him first. He was taller now, stronger. His movements carried confidence instead of caution. When he ran, it wasn't away from danger but towards something. "Thomas," Kit called, voice clear. No translator needed anymore. Thomas knelt as the child reached him. Kit wrapped his arms around Thomas's shoulders with surprising strength. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that simple contact. No history, no consequence, just presence. "You came," Kit said. "I said I would." Kit pulled back, studying him with eyes that saw more than they used to. "Mother says you do not have to anymore." Thomas smiled softly. "Maybe, but I wanted to." The ceremony that followed was small by galactic standards. No fleets, no banners carved into orbit, just representatives standing together, marking something fragile they had all agreed to protect. Peace did not need spectacle. It needed witnesses. When the chieftain spoke, her voice carried without amplification. "We once believed survival required us to harden ourselves against compassion," she said. "We were wrong." She paused, gaze sweeping the gathering. "Strength did not save us. Fear did not save us. A choice did." Her eyes found Thomas, not as a symbol, as a person. After the crowd dispersed, Thomas sat alone on a stone bench and let himself feel it all. Relief, sadness, the quiet grief that lived alongside hope. Peace had not erased his scars. It had given them context. A union representative approached him later. "They're rewriting the protocols," she said. "First contact, engagement rules, humanitarian overrides." Thomas nodded. "Good. They want your input." He considered that. For years, his value had been measured in obedience. Now it was being measured in judgment. "I'll help," he said, "as long as we remember one thing." She waited. "That rules don't make us humane," Thomas said. "People do." That evening, as stars emerged over Prime, Thomas walked the garden paths alone. The talisman rested in his pocket, warm from his hand. He no longer needed to touch it constantly. The lesson it carried had settled deeper now. He stopped near a young tree planted to mark the end of the war. Its roots were shallow, still vulnerable, but growing. Thomas placed his palm against the soil. He understood something then with a clarity that didn't demand words. Humanity had never been about perfection, or innocence, or the absence of violence. It was about what you did after you understood the cost. It was about standing in the space between fear and choice, and choosing anyway. Not loudly, not proudly, but deliberately. Sometimes dignity didn't shout its presence. It didn't carve its name into monuments. It simply acted. And in doing so, it reminded the universe, quietly, stubbornly, that even after the darkest wars, some lights were worth protecting. Especially the small ones. Especially when no one was watching. What happens after the story ends, when no one is watching anymore? Thomas stayed on Prime longer than anyone expected. Longer than the officials who measured time in mandates and milestones. Longer than the storytellers who preferred clean endings and decisive departures. Life, he had learned, rarely respected that kind of symmetry. The peace garden changed slowly. Some growths failed and were quietly replaced. Others thrived in ways no one had predicted, bending toward light that shifted with the seasons. The crystalline structures sang differently as the air warmed and cooled, their tones never quite repeating themselves. Harmony, Thomas realized, wasn't static. It responded. It adjusted. It listened. So did he. He took a modest role on the joint council that formed in the months that followed. Not a commander, not a representative of humanity's pride, just a presence when one was needed. Often, he said very little. He had discovered that silence, used carefully, could invite others to speak more honestly than authority ever had. There were setbacks, arguments flared, old wounds reopened without warning, a border incident here, A misunderstanding there. Peace was not a straight line, it was a series of corrections. Each one tempted people to fall back into what they knew best. Fear was efficient. Thomas still felt it sometimes. A tightening in his chest when voices rose too quickly. A flicker of readiness when sudden movement crossed his vision. The war had trained his body well. It would never fully forget. But now, when fear arrived, it didn't take control. He acknowledged it. Let it pass. That was the difference. One afternoon, Kit sat beside him on a low wall overlooking the garden. Older now, thoughtful. "Do you ever wish," Kit asked carefully, "that you had never found me?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched children playing below, saw a human girl trip, saw another child help her up without being asked. Ordinary moments, once impossible, now quietly common. "No," Thomas said at last, "but I do wish the universe hadn't given me so many chances to learn the same lesson." Kit tilted his head. "Why does it keep doing that?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Because learning once isn't enough." As years passed, Thomas stepped back more often, let others lead, trusted that the values taking root didn't require him standing guard forever. Letting go was harder than any battlefield had ever been. It always was. On his final day as an active council member, there was no ceremony, just nods, shared understanding. Knowing when to step aside, Thomas had learned, was also part of peace. He packed lightly. Before leaving, he walked the garden one last time and stopped at the tree planted to mark the end of the war. Its trunk was thicker now, roots deep enough to survive storms. Thomas pressed his palm against the bark. "I won't forget," he murmured, "not as a vow, as a truth." As his shuttle lifted, Prime shrinking beneath him, Thomas felt no surge of triumph, no swell of legacy, just gratitude, for the child who had reminded him what mattered, for the enemies who had chosen to become something more, for the quiet moments where fear had been met with restraint instead of violence. The universe would face wars again, he knew that. Stories like his did not end conflict forever, they did not fix everything. But they left markers, proof that another way had existed once, and could exist again. Thomas Reed was not remembered as a hero in most official records. He appeared as an anomaly, a footnote, a man who broke protocol at the wrong moment and somehow made it the right one. That was enough, because humanity had never been about dominance or perfection, not about victory carved into history. It was about the choices made when no one was cheering, the restraint shown when anger felt justified, the courage to see a life, small, fragile, inconvenient, and decide it mattered. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't demand attention or carve its name into monuments. It simply acts. And in doing so, it quietly changes the shape of the future. Especially when no one is watching.